The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos limped through the main courtyard. Her right leg, still healing from shrapnel wounds sustained during her last deployment in Afghanistan, protested with each step. The metal braces hidden beneath her uniform pants clicked softly against the prosthetic components that had become part of her new reality. Maria had been walking this same path for 3 weeks now, ever since her return from the overseas medical facility. Each morning, she made her way from the rehabilitation center to the physical therapy unit, a journey that should have taken 5 minutes, but now required 15. The other personnel on base had grown accustomed to seeing her slow progress, though their reactions varied dramatically. Some offered respectful nods of acknowledgement. Others whispered among themselves, their conversations dying abruptly when she passed within earshot. But it was the third group that troubled her most, those who seemed to find entertainment in her struggle. As Maria approached the Central Plaza area where several units conducted their morning briefings, she noticed a cluster of Navy personnel gathered near the flagpole. Among them stood Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, a woman whose reputation preceded her wherever she went. Sarah was part of an elite unit that few people talked about openly, but everyone knew existed. The Female SEALs program had been officially acknowledged only recently, and Sarah was among the first women to complete the grueling selection process. What made Sarah's presence particularly notable this morning was the group of male Marines who had positioned themselves strategically to observe both women. Maria recognized several faces from previous encounters, men who had made their opinions about women in combat roles abundantly clear through snide comments and barely concealed hostility. Sergeant First Class Mike Rodriguez stepped forward from the group, his voice carrying easily across the plaza. Well, looks like our wounded warrior is making her daily trek," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "How's that hero walk coming along, Santos? Still taking the scenic route everywhere?" Maria kept her eyes forward, focusing on maintaining her balance and rhythm. She had learned early in her recovery that engaging with Rodriguez and his followers only escalated situations unnecessarily. But his words stung nonetheless, particularly because they diminished not just her current condition, but the sacrifice that had led to it. "I heard she's thinking about trying to return to active duty," another voice chimed in. This belonged to Corporal Jake Morrison, a young Marine whose combat experience consisted primarily of training exercises and one brief deployment to a relatively safe forward operating base. Can you imagine? A limping Marine trying to keep up with a real unit. The laughter that followed was harsh and deliberate. Maria felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment, but she continued walking. Each step became more difficult, not because of physical pain, but because of the weight of their mockery. Sarah Chun observed this exchange with growing disgust. She had been conducting a quiet conversation with her teammate about their upcoming training schedule, but the Marine's behavior was impossible to ignore. As one of the first female SEALs, Sarah had faced her own share of skepticism and hostility throughout her career. The difference was that her achievements had eventually silenced most critics. Maria, however, was in a vulnerable position that made her an easy target. "Hey Santos," Rodriguez called out again, his voice dripping with false concern. "Maybe you should consider a desk job. I hear the Pentagon needs more paper pushers. Probably right up your speed these days." This comment drew even more laughter from his group. Several other personnel in the area shifted uncomfortably, clearly disapproving of the harassment, but unwilling to intervene. The military's complex social hierarchy made such interventions risky, particularly when they involved calling out fellow service members. Maria's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she maintained her forward progress. She had been a Marine for 8 years before her injury, serving 3 combat deployments with distinction. Her personnel file included 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, achievements that spoke to her courage and competence under fire. But none of that seemed to matter now that she needed mechanical assistance to walk. The injury itself had occurred during a convoy operation in Helmand Province. Maria's unit had been providing security for a humanitarian mission when their vehicle struck an improvised explosive device. The blast killed 2 Marines instantly and left Maria with severe leg injuries that required multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation. She had spent 4 months in military hospitals, enduring painful procedures and learning to walk again with the help of advanced prosthetics and bracing systems. What Rodriguez and his followers didn't know, or chose to ignore, was that Maria had saved 3 lives that day. After the explosion, Despite her own injuries, she had dragged two unconscious Marines to safety and provided covering fire while medical evacuation arrived. The citation for her Bronze Star specifically mentioned her extraordinary heroism under enemy fire and her complete disregard for personal safety in service to her fellow Marines. Sarah Chin knew none of these specific details, but she recognized the type of courage Maria displayed simply by continuing to show up each day. The SEAL training had taught Sarah to identify mental toughness in various forms, and Maria's quiet persistence in the face of public humiliation demonstrated exactly that quality. As Maria finally passed the group of Marines and began climbing the steps to the medical building, Rodriguez decided to deliver what he clearly considered a final blow. "That's right, just keep walking away," he shouted. "At least you're good at retreating now." The word retreating hit Maria like a physical blow. No Marine wanted to be accused of retreating, even in jest. It violated the most fundamental principle of Marine Corps culture, the idea that Marines never leave a fight, never abandon their positions, never give up. For Rodriguez to use that word against a wounded Marine showed either remarkable ignorance or deliberate cruelty. Sarah Chun had heard enough. She turned away from her teammate and began walking toward the group of Marines with the measured pace of someone who had made a decision. Her movement caught the attention of several personnel in the area, including Maria, who paused at the top of the medical building steps to observe what would happen next. "Excuse me, Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said calmly as she approached the group. Her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I couldn't help but notice your commentary about Staff Sergeant Santos." Rodriguez straightened slightly, recognizing that he was being addressed by a superior officer, but his expression remained defiant. "Just making conversation, ma'am. No harm intended." "No harm intended," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting, because from where I was standing, it sounded like you were questioning the courage and commitment of a decorated combat veteran who was wounded while saving the lives of her fellow Marines." The plaza had grown noticeably quieter as other personnel realized that a confrontation was developing. Maria found herself holding her breath as she watched Sarah position herself directly in front of Rodriguez, her posture relaxed but unmistakably confident. "I'm sure Staff Sergeant Santos appreciates your concern for her well-being," Sarah continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the clear challenge in her words. "After all, it must be difficult for someone with your extensive combat experience to watch a wounded warrior struggle with the aftermath of actual enemy contact." Rodriguez's face reddened as he recognized the subtle insult embedded in Sarah's comment. His combat record, while respectable, paled in comparison to Maria's, a fact that Sarah had somehow intuited despite having no access to their service records. "Look, ma'am, I don't know what your problem is," Rodriguez replied, his voice rising slightly. "But Santos knew the risks when she signed up. If she can't handle the job anymore, maybe she should step aside for someone who can." "Someone who can," Sarah nodded slowly. "Like you, perhaps?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rodriguez found himself in an uncomfortable position, unable to claim superior qualifications without appearing arrogant, but unwilling to back down in front of his peers. "I'm just saying that the military isn't a charity," he said finally. "We need people who can fight, not people who need help walking to the medical building." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but those who knew her well would have recognized the danger signs. Her voice became even quieter, forcing everyone nearby to strain to hear her words. "Sergeant Rodriguez, in your professional opinion, what qualities make an effective warrior?" The question seemed straightforward, but Rodriguez sensed a trap. "Strength, speed, tactical awareness, the ability to operate under pressure," he answered carefully. "Courage," Sarah prompted. "Yes, ma'am. Courage. The willingness to sacrifice for others. Of course. Mental toughness in the face of adversity." Rodriguez nodded, uncertain where this line of questioning was leading. "Then, perhaps," Sarah said, her voice still calm but now carrying an edge that made several Marines take unconscious steps backward, "you could explain to me how Staff Sergeant Santos fails to meet those criteria." The challenge was now explicit. Rodriguez looked around at his supporters, hoping for backup that didn't materialize. The other Marines seemed suddenly fascinated by their boots or the distant horizon, unwilling to meet his eyes. "She's injured," Rodriguez said weakly. "She can't perform at full capacity." "Neither could Audie Murphy after he was wounded," Sarah replied. "Neither could Dan Daly after he took shrapnel. Neither could Chesty Puller after he was shot. Should they have stepped aside for someone who could walk faster?" The reference to legendary military heroes made Rodriguez's position even more untenable. These were names that every Marine knew and respected, warriors whose courage was beyond question despite injuries sustained in combat. Maria watched this exchange with growing amazement. Sarah Chun barely knew her, had no obligation to intervene, and was risking her own standing by confronting a group of Marines who clearly resented female authority. Yet she continued pressing her point with the precision of a skilled tactician. Furthermore, Sarah continued, I find it interesting that you question the value of someone who was wounded while saving lives, when your own greatest military achievement appears to be mastering the art of verbal harassment from a safe distance. This last comment drew audible gasps from several onlookers. Sarah had just accused Rodriguez of cowardice, albeit in diplomatic language that made direct retaliation difficult. Rodriguez's face had progressed from red to purple as he struggled to formulate a response. His supporters shifted uncomfortably, suddenly, aware that their association with his behavior might reflect poorly on their own reputations. Ma'am, I don't think you understand the situation, Rodriguez finally managed. This isn't about courage or sacrifice. It's about maintaining standards. The military is no place for people who can't keep up. Sarah nodded as if considering this argument seriously. You're absolutely right about maintaining standards, she agreed. High standards are essential for military effectiveness. Which brings me to my next question. What standards are you maintaining by publicly mocking a wounded veteran? The question struck like a precision-guided weapon, exposing the fundamental contradiction in Rodriguez's position. He claimed to support high military standards while engaging in behavior that violated the most basic principles of military honor and respect for fellow service members. I wasn't mocking anyone, Rodriguez protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Everyone present had heard his earlier comments, making denial pointless. Perhaps your definition of mockery differs from mine, Sarah observed. In my experience, suggesting that a decorated Marine should stick to paper pushing and keep retreating might be interpreted as mockery by a reasonable observer. She had quoted his exact words, demonstrating that she had been listening carefully to the entire exchange. This attention to detail was typical of special operations personnel, trained to observe and remember crucial information even during apparently casual encounters. Rodriguez realized that he had been outmaneuvered completely. Sarah had turned his own words against him, challenged his military credentials, and exposed the weakness of his position without raising her voice or using profanity. Her technique was surgical in its precision and devastating in its effectiveness. Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding, Rodriguez said finally, attempting to retreat gracefully from an untenable position. I don't think there has been, Sarah replied firmly. I think you've made your position very clear, and so have I. The question now is what you intend to do about it. The plaza had become completely silent except for the distant sounds of military training activities. Even the morning breeze seemed to have stopped, as if nature itself was waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve. Maria found herself leaning forward slightly, straining to hear Sarah's next words. She had witnessed many confrontations during her military career, but none quite like this one. Sarah Chun was systematically dismantling Rodriguez's position while maintaining complete professional composure. What I intend to do, Rodriguez said slowly, is continue performing my duties as a Marine. Excellent, Sarah nodded. And I trust that those duties will include treating your fellow Marines with the respect they've earned through their service and sacrifice. It wasn't exactly an apology, but everyone present understood that Rodriguez had been decisively defeated in this exchange. His attempts to justify harassment of a wounded veteran had been exposed as morally bankrupt, and his own military credentials had been found wanting when compared to those of his target. The group of Marines began to disperse slowly, suddenly, remembering urgent duties that required their immediate attention. Rodriguez lingered for a moment, perhaps hoping to salvage some dignity from the situation, but Sarah's steady gaze made it clear that the conversation was over. As Rodriguez finally walked away, Sarah turned her attention toward the medical building where Maria still stood watching. Their eyes met across the plaza, and Sarah offered a slight nod of acknowledgement before returning to her own duties. Maria remained on the steps for several minutes, processing what she had just witnessed. A stranger had intervened on her behalf, not because of any personal obligation or friendship, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Sarah Chun had risked her own reputation and relationships to defend Maria's honor, asking for nothing in return. The incident would have consequences that neither woman could fully anticipate. Rodriguez and his supporters would not simply forget their humiliation, and Sarah Chun had made enemies among people who might look for opportunities to retaliate. But, for Maria, the immediate effect was profound. For the first time since her injury, she felt genuinely supported by a fellow service member. As she finally entered the medical building and began her daily physical therapy session, Maria found herself thinking not about Rodriguez's cruel words, but about Sarah's precise and devastating response. There was something inspiring about watching someone refuse to tolerate injustice, even when intervention carried personal risks. What Maria didn't yet realize was that this morning's events represented only the beginning of a much larger confrontation. Rodriguez and his supporters had been challenged publicly, their behavior exposed as unworthy of their uniforms. Such humiliation rarely went unanswered in military culture, where pride and reputation held enormous importance. Sarah Chun, meanwhile, had demonstrated something that would soon become much more significant than a simple defense of Maria Santos. She had shown that the female SEALs possessed not only the technical skills to match their male counterparts, but also the moral courage to stand up for their principles regardless of the personal cost. The real test would come in the days ahead, when Rodriguez and others like him would inevitably seek opportunities to prove that women had no place in elite military units. They would discover, perhaps too late, that they had chosen the wrong target for their skepticism and hostility. The wounded Marine continued her slow walk to therapy, unaware that she had just witnessed the opening move in a conflict that would ultimately reshape perceptions about courage, strength, and what it truly meant to be a warrior in the modern military. 3 days after the confrontation in the plaza, the atmosphere on base had shifted dramatically. Word of Sarah Chun's defense of Maria Santos had spread through the informal networks that connected every military installation, growing and changing with each retelling. By evening, the story had evolved from a simple exchange of words into something approaching legend. In the enlisted quarters, Marines debated the incident with the passion usually reserved for sports rivalries or political arguments. Some praised Sarah's intervention as exactly the kind of leadership they expected from elite personnel. Others viewed it as an outsider interfering in Marine business, particularly troubling because that outsider happened to be a woman from a unit that many still questioned. Rodriguez had spent those 3 days growing increasingly agitated as he encountered variations of the story throughout the base. In some versions, he was portrayed as a bully picking on a wounded hero. In others, Sarah Chun was described as having humiliated an entire group of Marines with surgical precision. None of the versions reflected favorably on his behavior or judgment. The situation reached a breaking point during Thursday morning's routine training assembly. Rodriguez's unit had gathered for their weekly briefing when Staff Sergeant Williams, their section leader, addressed the elephant that had been lurking in every conversation. "I've been hearing interesting stories about some of you," Williams announced, his weathered face showing no emotion. "Stories about Marines who apparently have too much time on their hands and not enough sense to use it productively." The assembled Marines shifted uncomfortably. Williams had 22 years of service and a reputation for direct communication that left little room for misinterpretation. "Let me be crystal clear about something," Williams continued. "Any Marine who thinks it's appropriate to harass wounded personnel is demonstrating exactly the kind of judgment that gets people killed in combat. And any Marine who gets schooled by Navy personnel because he can't maintain basic military courtesy is an embarrassment to this uniform." Rodriguez felt every eye in the formation turned toward him. Williams wasn't using names, but the reference was unmistakable to anyone who had heard the Plaza incident story. Furthermore, Williams added, "I've been informed that certain personnel have been making comments about the capabilities and qualifications of our Navy colleagues. Apparently, some Marines think they're qualified to judge the standards and performance of units they know nothing about." The critique stung because it highlighted Rodriguez's fundamental ignorance about SEAL training and selection. Like most Marines, he knew only the general reputation of Special Operations Forces, not the specific requirements and procedures they endured. His comments about standards and capabilities had been based on assumption rather than knowledge. "Here's what's going to happen," Williams announced. "Next week, we're conducting joint training exercises with several Navy units, including some Special Operations personnel. This will give certain Marines an opportunity to demonstrate their superior qualifications and prove that their opinions about standards are based on actual experience rather than ignorance and prejudice. The announcement sent ripples of excitement and anxiety through the formation. Joint training exercises were relatively rare and typically challenging. Marines prided themselves on their reputation as elite infantry, but special operations units brought their own formidable capabilities to any collaborative effort. Rodriguez realized immediately that he had been maneuvered into an impossible position. Williams had just announced that his unit would be working alongside the very people he had criticized, creating an opportunity for direct comparison that could only end badly for him. Meanwhile, Sarah Chun was conducting her own morning briefing with a very different tone and focus. Her team consisted of 4 other female SEALs, each representing years of intensive training and selection that had eliminated hundreds of other candidates. Lieutenant Junior Grade Amanda Torres, a former Marine herself, had heard about the Plaza incident through her own networks. "Ma'am, I've been getting questions about next week's joint exercise," she reported. Apparently, some Marines think it's going to be a demonstration of why women shouldn't be in combat units. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. She had expected this kind of reaction, understanding that Rodriguez's public humiliation would likely motivate him to seek opportunities for redemption. Joint training exercises provided exactly the kind of high-visibility venue where he might attempt to prove his original points about standards and capabilities. "What kind of questions?" Sarah asked. "Nothing direct, but lots of interest in our physical standards, our selection process, whether we've actually seen combat," Torres replied. "The usual stuff, but with more edge than normal." Petty Officer First Class Jessica Kim, the team's communications specialist, spoke up from her position near the equipment lockers. "I've been monitoring radio chatter from the Marine units. They're treating this exercise like some kind of competition rather than collaborative training. This concerns Sarah more than outright hostility would have. Competitive training could be valuable for building skills and esprit de corps, but it could also become dangerous when participants prioritized winning over learning. Military training exercises involved real weapons, explosive devices, and scenarios that could injure or kill participants who made poor decisions." "What's the exercise format?" asked Chief Petty Officer Lisa Park, whose demolitions expertise made her particularly valuable during complex operations. Sarah consulted her briefing materials. Multi-phase operation, initial reconnaissance, tactical movement, simulated combat scenarios, and extraction under pressure. Standard stuff, but compressed into a 2-day timeline that doesn't allow for mistakes. The compressed timeline was significant because it would test endurance as well as technical skills. Military operations rarely allowed for extended rest periods, and effective units needed to maintain performance standards even when exhausted. "Who's running oversight?" Torres inquired. "Mixed command structure. Marine officers for the overall exercise, Navy personnel for special operations components, independent observers for evaluation," Sarah replied. "Should be fair, assuming everyone follows established protocols." The mixed command structure was designed to prevent bias, but Sarah understood that fairness depended on the professionalism of all participants. If Rodriguez and his supporters approached the exercise as an opportunity to prove female inferiority rather than develop collaborative capabilities, they could create problems that transcended simple competition. That afternoon, Maria Santos was finishing her physical therapy session when Dr. Captain Jennifer Hayes approached with an unusual request. "Staff Sergeant Santos, I've been asked to evaluate your current capabilities for potential participation in next week's training exercise," Dr. Hayes announced. "Apparently, someone thinks you might be ready for limited field activities." Maria looked up from the balanced training apparatus she had been using, surprised by the suggestion. Her rehabilitation had progressed steadily, but she hadn't expected to be cleared for anything approaching combat training so soon. "What kind of participation?" Maria asked cautiously. Her experience with medical evaluations had taught her to be suspicious of overly optimistic assessments that might reflect wishful thinking rather than realistic appraisal. "Observer status initially, with possible upgraded participation if you demonstrate adequate mobility and endurance," Dr. Hayes explained. "The exercise includes scenarios that require tactical thinking rather than just physical performance. Your experience could be valuable for evaluation purposes." Maria realized immediately that this opportunity was connected to the Plaza incident. Someone had decided that her presence during the joint exercise would serve a purpose beyond simple training objectives. "Doctor, can I ask who made this request?" Maria inquired. Dr. Hayes smiled slightly. "Let's just say that certain Navy personnel have expressed interest in your professional opinions about combat operations. They believe your experience might provide valuable perspectives during the evaluation process. The careful phrasing told Maria everything she needed to know. Sarah Chun had somehow arranged for her inclusion in the exercise, probably as a way of demonstrating that wounded Marines retained value and capabilities that went beyond pure physical performance. What would observer status involve? Maria asked. Movement with the units, observation of tactics and procedures, participation in after-action reviews, Dr. Hayes replied. Basically, everything except direct participation in combat simulations. Maria considered the offer carefully. Part of her was eager to return to field activities, even in a limited capacity. But she also understood that her presence would inevitably become part of whatever larger conflict was developing between Rodriguez's faction and the female SEALs. If I accept, what are my obligations? Maria asked. Professional observation and honest evaluation, Dr. Hayes answered immediately. Nothing more, nothing less. Your job would be to watch what happens and provide feedback about what you see. The simplicity of the answer appealed to Maria. She wouldn't be required to take sides or prove anything beyond her ability to observe and analyze military operations. Those were skills that her injury hadn't affected. I'll do it, Maria decided. Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly. Excellent. I'll clear you for limited participation pending final medical evaluation. Just remember that observer status means exactly that. Observe, don't participate in anything that exceeds your current physical capabilities. That evening, Rodriguez met with his closest supporters in an unofficial gathering at the base recreation center. The group included Morrison, 2 other Marines from their unit, and Staff Sergeant Kevin Walsh from a different company who had heard about the Plaza incident and wanted to express solidarity. This exercise is exactly what we need, Rodriguez announced to the group. Finally, we get a chance to show what real Marines can do compared to these publicity stunt special operations people. Walsh nodded enthusiastically. I've been saying for years that this whole women in combat thing is political correctness run wild. Now we get to prove it. Morrison seemed less certain. Sarge, what if they're actually good? I mean, they did make it through SEAL training. Rodriguez waved dismissively. Training is one thing. Real performance is something else. You can lower standards to let anyone pass a course, but you can't fake actual capability under pressure. This reasoning contained a fundamental flaw that none of them recognized. SEAL training standards hadn't been lowered for women. Female candidates had been required to meet exactly the same requirements as their male counterparts. The assumption that female success must reflect reduced standards revealed more about Rodriguez's prejudices than about actual military policies. Besides, Rodriguez continued, we're Marines. Infantry is what we do. These Navy people might be good at sneaking around and underwater stuff, but when it comes to actual fighting, Marines are the gold standard. The group's confidence was based partly on legitimate pride in Marine Corps traditions and partly on ignorance about what SEAL training actually involved. They understood Marines to be superior infantry fighters without recognizing that SEAL selection included many of the same skills plus additional specialized capabilities. Walsh raised a practical concern. What if the evaluation criteria are biased toward their specialties? They might structure the exercise to favor their strengths. That's why we need to dominate every aspect, Rodriguez replied. Physical performance, tactical decisions, leadership under pressure. Show them that Marines don't just meet standards, we exceed them. The conversation continued for another hour, with each participant contributing suggestions about how to maximize their performance during the joint exercise. What none of them discussed was the possibility that their opponents might also be preparing intensively, bringing their own advantages and capabilities to the competition. Meanwhile, Sarah Chun was conducting a very different type of preparation session with her team. Rather than focusing on ways to dominate their Marine counterparts, she was analyzing the exercise requirements to identify opportunities for demonstrating collaborative effectiveness. Remember that this isn't about proving we're better than Marines, Sarah emphasized. It's about proving that we're professional military personnel who can work effectively with any unit. Torres nodded agreement. The best outcome would be successful mission completion with full integration between units. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. But we also need to be prepared for the possibility that certain Marines will approach this as a competition rather than collaborative training. Kim looked up from her equipment checklist. How do we handle it if they try to sabotage joint operations to make us look bad? The question was more serious than it might initially appear. Military exercises involved complex coordination between multiple units, and Deliberate non-cooperation by any participant could compromise mission success and potentially endanger personnel. We focus on our own performance and maintain professional standards regardless of what anyone else does, Sarah replied. If they want to demonstrate poor teamwork and unprofessional behavior, that's their choice. Our job is to prove that we can succeed regardless of the circumstances. Park raised another concern. What about the wounded Marine? Santos. I heard she's being included as an observer. Sarah had indeed requested Maria's participation, but for reasons that her team didn't fully understand. Staff Sergeant Santos brings combat experience and tactical knowledge that could be valuable during evaluation. Her presence also demonstrates something important about the value of wounded warriors. Are we using her to make a point? Torres asked directly. Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. We're demonstrating that military effectiveness involves more than just physical capability. Santos has knowledge and experience that remain valuable despite her injuries. If that makes a point about how we value our people, then, yes. The distinction was important because it reflected Sarah's understanding that the exercise had implications beyond simple training. How the various participants treated Maria Santos would reveal important information about their values and priorities. As the week progressed toward the joint exercise, tensions on the base continued to escalate. Marines and Navy personnel found themselves taking sides in a conflict that neither group had initially sought. The original Plaza incident had evolved into something much larger, a test case about women in combat, about military standards, about the meaning of courage and competence. Rodriguez and his supporters prepared for the exercise with the intensity of warriors heading into actual combat. They conducted additional physical training, reviewed tactical procedures, and planned strategies for maximizing their performance advantages. Sarah Chen's team prepared with equal intensity but different objectives. They focused on teamwork, communication protocols, and adaptability under changing circumstances. Their goal was successful mission completion rather than individual dominance. Maria Santos prepared by reviewing current military tactics and procedures, ensuring that her observer role would be informed by up-to-date knowledge of how modern units operated. Her preparations were intellectual rather than physical, but no less important for the success of her assignment. None of them fully understood that they were about to participate in something that would be remembered long after the specific details of their training exercise were forgotten. They were approaching a confrontation that would test not just their individual capabilities, but their fundamental beliefs about what made effective warriors in the modern military. The stage was set for a demonstration that would shock everyone involved, though not in the ways that any of them expected. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made military training both challenging and invigorating. The joint exercise area had been established in a remote section of the base where realistic combat scenarios could be conducted without interference from normal operations. Temporary command posts, observation towers, and equipment staging areas transformed the landscape into a miniature battlefield. Maria Santos arrived at the staging area 45 minutes before the scheduled briefing, wanting to ensure that her mobility limitations wouldn't delay any aspects of the exercise. Her observer credentials hung from a lanyard around her neck, clearly identifying her status to all participants and safety personnel. The scene that greeted her was both familiar and strange. Military exercises always generated a particular type of controlled chaos as units prepared equipment, reviewed procedures, and coordinated with unfamiliar personnel. What made this morning different was the palpable tension between the Marine and Navy contingents. Rodriguez and his supporters had claimed a section of the staging area where they conducted final equipment checks with exaggerated precision, clearly hoping to impress observers with their attention to detail. Their gear was immaculate, their uniforms perfectly maintained, and their movements crisp and professional. 30 meters away, Sarah Chen's team prepared with equal professionalism, but less theatricality. They focused on functional equipment checks, communication protocols, and coordination procedures rather than visual presentation. Their preparation reflected confidence born of experience rather than anxiety about proving themselves. Colonel James Mitchell, the exercise director, called all participants to attention for the initial briefing. A career Marine officer with extensive combat experience, Mitchell had volunteered to oversee the exercise specifically because he wanted to observe the interaction between traditional and special operations units. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Exercise Iron Unity, Mitchell announced to the assembled personnel. This exercise is designed to evaluate collaborative capabilities between Marine infantry and Navy Special Operations units under realistic combat conditions. The exercise name was carefully chosen to emphasize cooperation rather than competition, though Mitchell suspected that some participants had different interpretations of the objectives. Your mission involves 4 phases, Mitchell continued. Phase 1, reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Phase 2, tactical movement to objectives. Phase 3, coordinated assault on simulated enemy positions. Phase 4, extraction under contact. He paused to ensure that everyone understood the scope of what they would be attempting. The 4 phases represented a compressed version of complex military operations that normally required weeks of planning and preparation. Each phase will be evaluated independently, but your overall success depends on effective collaboration between units, Mitchell emphasized. Individual heroics that compromise team performance will be noted negatively, regardless of personal achievement levels. This warning was directed primarily at Rodriguez and his supporters, though Mitchell's neutral tone avoided singling anyone out explicitly. Observer personnel will accompany units throughout all phases, Mitchell added, nodding toward Maria and 2 other wounded veterans who had been assigned similar roles. Their job is to provide feedback about tactical decisions, unit coordination, and overall mission effectiveness. Rodriguez bristled at the implication that wounded personnel were qualified to evaluate active duty performance, but he kept his objections private. The exercise had officially begun, and any complaints about protocols would be noted as unprofessional behavior. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Barnes, the Navy representative, stepped forward to address special operations aspects of the exercise. A former SEAL herself, Barnes understood exactly what Sarah Chen's team could accomplish under optimal conditions. Special operations elements will provide reconnaissance, target identification, and precision capabilities, Barnes announced. Marine elements will provide assault capacity, area security, and extraction support. Success requires seamless integration of these complementary capabilities. The division of responsibilities was logical, but also created multiple opportunities for friction. Each unit would depend on the other for mission-critical support, making cooperation essential rather than optional. Communication protocols are standard NATO format, Barnes continued. All units will monitor primary and backup frequencies. No improvised procedures without command approval. Sarah Chen recognized the wisdom behind this requirement. Military communication protocols existed specifically to prevent the kind of miscommunication that could occur when unfamiliar units worked together under pressure. Phase 1 began immediately after the briefing concluded. The scenario involved gathering intelligence about simulated enemy positions located 3 kilometers from the staging area. Success required stealth, accuracy, and effective reporting of tactical information. Sarah's team moved out first. Their role focused on close-range reconnaissance that would identify specific targets and defensive positions. They traveled light, carrying only essential equipment and communication gear necessary for their mission. Rodriguez's Marine unit followed 30 minutes later, tasked with establishing overwatch positions that could provide supporting fire during the eventual assault phase. Their equipment load was heavier, reflecting their role as primary assault forces. Maria Santos accompanied the Marine unit, traveling in a support vehicle that allowed her to observe their movement and tactical decisions without slowing their progress. Her position also provided excellent communication access, enabling her to monitor radio traffic between all participating units. The terrain chosen for the exercise was challenging but realistic. Rolling hills covered with dense vegetation that provided concealment but limited visibility. Movement required careful navigation and constant awareness of potential enemy observation points. Sarah's team demonstrated immediately why SEAL training emphasized adaptability and innovation. Rather than following obvious routes that might be monitored by opposing forces, they identified creative paths that minimized exposure while maintaining progress toward their objectives. Their movement was virtually silent, accomplished through techniques that most observers would have considered impossibly difficult. They communicated through hand signals and encrypted radio bursts that lasted only seconds, providing necessary coordination without revealing their positions. Rodriguez watched their progress through binoculars from his overwatch position, grudgingly impressed despite his determination to find fault with their performance. The female SEALs moved with a precision and confidence that clearly reflected extensive training and experience. "They're good at sneaking around," Morrison whispered, apparently surprised by what he was observing. Sneaking around isn't fighting, Rodriguez replied dismissively. Wait until we get to the real action. But even Rodriguez had to admit that the reconnaissance information provided by Sarah's team was exceptionally detailed and accurate. Their reports included precise target coordinates, defensive positions, personnel estimates, and recommendations for assault approaches. The intelligence was exactly what Marine assault forces needed for effective planning. Maria Santos observed these dynamics with growing fascination. Her radio position allowed her to monitor all communication between units, providing insight into how the different groups approach tactical challenges. Sarah's team communicated with clinical efficiency, sharing information and coordinating actions with minimal unnecessary chatter. Their radio discipline was excellent, maintaining security while ensuring that all participants received necessary updates. Rodriguez's Marines communicated with equal professionalism during official transmissions, but Maria could hear informal conversations during communication breaks that revealed ongoing skepticism about their Navy counterparts. Think they can handle the shooting phase? One Marine asked during a brief pause. We'll find out soon enough, Rodriguez replied. Sneaking around is one thing, but combat is something else entirely. These comments revealed the persistent assumption that special operations personnel were somehow deficient in basic combat skills, despite evidence to the contrary. SEAL training included extensive combat instruction that exceeded Marine standards in many areas. Phase 1 concluded successfully after 6 hours of reconnaissance operations. Both units had completed their assigned tasks effectively, providing comprehensive intelligence that would support the remaining phases of the exercise. Colonel Mitchell's preliminary evaluation was positive, but cautious. Excellent individual performance by both units, he announced to the assembled personnel. Phase 2 will test your ability to coordinate movement under simulated enemy observation. Phase 2 began immediately, with both units required to move to assault positions while avoiding detection by opposing force personnel who had been positioned throughout the area. The scenarios simulated the approach phase of a real combat operation, where stealth and coordination were essential for success. This phase would prove more challenging because it required active cooperation between units rather than independent operations. Marine and SEAL elements needed to coordinate their movements to avoid interfering with each other while maintaining the stealth necessary for mission success. Sarah's team took point for the movement phase, using their reconnaissance information to guide both units along routes that avoided enemy observation posts. This required constant communication and precise timing to ensure that Marine elements could follow without compromising stealth. The complexity of the coordination became apparent immediately. Marine units carried more equipment and personnel than SEAL teams, making them less flexible during movement. However, their firepower and assault capabilities would be essential during the combat phase. Rodriguez found himself depending heavily on navigation information provided by Sarah's team, a dependence that conflicted with his desire to prove Marine superiority. The female SEALs had become indispensable for mission success, making his criticism of their capabilities increasingly difficult to maintain. Alpha Team, hold position for 30 seconds, Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. Enemy patrol passing your grid reference. Rodriguez's unit froze immediately, trusting the intelligence despite his personal feelings about its source. Through his binoculars, he watched an opposing force patrol pass within 50 meters of their position, unaware of their presence. Clear to continue movement, Sarah reported 60 seconds later. The Marine unit resumed their advance, now acutely aware that Sarah's reconnaissance had prevented their detection and possible mission failure. Such close calls were common during military exercises, but they demonstrated the value of accurate intelligence and effective coordination. Maria Santos observed these interactions with growing appreciation for the complexity of joint operations. Each unit brought unique capabilities, but success required trust and communication that transcended inter-service rivalries and personal prejudices. How are they doing? Dr. Hayes' voice came through Maria's earpiece. Medical personnel monitored all exercise participants to ensure that safety protocols were maintained. Better than expected, Maria replied quietly. Both units are performing well, but the Marines are starting to realize how much they depend on SEAL intelligence. This was exactly the kind of insight that Maria's observer role was designed to capture. The exercise was revealing important truths about modern military operations that might not be apparent to direct participants. Phase 2 concluded successfully after 4 hours of coordinated movement. Both units had reached their assault positions without detection, meeting all exercise objectives. More importantly, they had demonstrated effective cooperation despite initial mutual skepticism. Colonel Mitchell's evaluation reflected this success. Outstanding coordination between units, he announced. Phase 3 will test your ability to maintain that cooperation under simulated combat stress. Phase 3 represented the culmination of the exercise, a coordinated assault on simulated enemy positions that would require both units to perform at maximum effectiveness while supporting each other's operations. The scenario was complex and demanding. SEAL elements would eliminate specific high-value targets while Marine units conducted frontal assault operations against prepared defensive positions. Success required precise timing, effective communication, and mutual support under simulated enemy fire. Rodriguez felt confident about this phase because it emphasized the combat skills where Marines traditionally excelled. However, he was beginning to understand that his unit's success depended heavily on support provided by the female SEALs. Sarah's team prepared for the assault phase with characteristic thoroughness, reviewing target assignments and coordination procedures one final time. Their role required precision shooting and stealth infiltration that would eliminate enemy leadership while Marine units engaged defensive positions. The assault began at precisely 1,400 hours with Sarah's team moving into position for their precision targeting mission. Their approach required movement through heavily defended areas where detection would compromise the entire operation. Rodriguez's Marines initiated their assault 30 seconds later, using covering fire and tactical movement to engage simulated enemy positions. Their role was deliberately challenging, requiring them to overcome prepared defenses while maintaining coordination with SEAL elements. The exercise became intensely realistic as opposing force personnel used blank ammunition, pyrotechnics, and simulated casualties to create combat stress. Participants had to maintain tactical effectiveness while dealing with noise, confusion, and apparent casualties among their units. Sarah's team performed with surgical precision, eliminating their assigned targets with simulated sniper fire while remaining undetected by opposing forces. Their movement and shooting skills were exceptional, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything Rodriguez had previously witnessed. The Marines executed their assault with equal effectiveness, using suppressive fire and tactical movement to overrun defensive positions. Their combat skills were excellent, reflecting the high training standards that made Marine infantry among the world's most capable assault forces. What impressed Maria Santos most was how effectively the two units supported each other despite their different capabilities and approaches. SEAL precision targeting created opportunities for Marine assault actions, while Marine firepower provided cover for SEAL movement operations. "This is incredible," Maria whispered to herself as she observed the coordinated assault through binoculars. The level of cooperation and mutual support was far beyond what she had expected from units that had been antagonistic toward each other just days earlier. The assault phase concluded successfully with all objectives achieved within the specified timeframe. Both units had performed exceptionally, but their success clearly resulted from effective cooperation rather than individual excellence. Colonel Mitchell's preliminary assessment reflected this observation. "Outstanding performance by all units," he announced over the radio. "Prepare for Phase 4, extraction under contact." Phase 4 would test whether the units could maintain their cooperation while dealing with the stress of simulated enemy pursuit during extraction operations. It represented the kind of complex, multi-unit operation that defined modern military effectiveness. Rodriguez found himself in an uncomfortable position as Phase 4 began. His unit's success during the exercise had been undeniable, but it was equally undeniable that much of that success resulted from SEAL support and coordination. His original assumptions about female capabilities and special operations effectiveness were being systematically demolished by observable evidence. More troubling was his growing recognition that Sarah Chun and her team possessed exactly the kind of military competence that he claimed to value most highly. Their performance under pressure, tactical decision-making, and professional behavior exceeded his own unit's standards in many areas. As the final phase of the exercise began, Rodriguez realized that he faced a choice between maintaining his prejudices and acknowledging the evidence before his eyes. The decision would determine not only his own future effectiveness, but also his ability to function as part of the modern military team that was rapidly evolving around him. The wounded Marine continued her observation duties, unaware that she was about to witness something that would fundamentally change how everyone involved thought about courage, competence, and military effectiveness. The real test was just beginning. Phase 4 began with both units moving toward the designated extraction point, a clearing located 2 kilometers from the assault site, where simulated helicopter evacuation would conclude the exercise. The scenario required them to maintain tactical formation while dealing with pursuing enemy forces using harassment tactics and delaying actions. What none of the participants knew was that the exercise was about to become much more than a training simulation. Real danger was approaching from an entirely unexpected direction, and their ability to handle genuine crisis would soon overshadow any questions about exercise performance. The extraction movement proceeded smoothly for the first 30 minutes. Both units maintained good tactical discipline while covering the required distance efficiently. Sarah's team provided advanced reconnaissance, while Rodriguez's Marines handled rear security against simulated pursuers. Maria Santos traveled with the command element, monitoring radio communications and observing coordination between units. Her position in the command vehicle provided excellent visibility of both team movements and overall tactical situation. At 1,547 hours, everything changed. "Command, this is Observation Tower 3. Came an urgent voice over the emergency frequency. We have real-world emergency developing in your exercise area. Civilian aircraft down approximately 800 meters northeast of your position." Colonel Mitchell's response was immediate and professional. "All exercise units, this is command. Cease exercise operations immediately. Real-world emergency declared. Stand by for emergency tasking." The transition from simulated to actual emergency required split-second mental adjustment by all participants. Training exercises used similar communication protocols, but the urgency in the tower operator's voice was unmistakably genuine. "Tower 3, this is command. Provide detailed situation report," Mitchell requested. "Sir, small civilian aircraft appears to have made emergency landing in heavy terrain. Aircraft is visible, but access is extremely difficult due to ravine location. Unknown number of personnel on board. Unknown condition of occupants." Mitchell quickly consulted his maps while considering available resources. The exercise units were already deployed in the field with full equipment and communication capabilities. They represented his best immediate response option for what could be a life-or-death rescue operation. Sarah Chun recognized the change in situation immediately and began mentally shifting her team's focus from exercise completion to emergency response. SEAL training included extensive search and rescue procedures, making her unit well qualified for this type of mission. Rodriguez experienced a more complex reaction. Part of him was relieved that the exercise had been interrupted before the final evaluation, but he also understood that they were now facing a situation where real lives might depend on their performance. "All units, this is command," Mitchell announced. "Exercise operations are terminated. You are now tasked with emergency search and rescue mission. Marine units will provide security and casualty evacuation support. Special operations units will conduct initial reconnaissance and access assessment." The mission assignment reflected each unit's specialized capabilities while requiring continued cooperation under genuinely dangerous conditions. Unlike the exercise, mistakes during this operation could result in actual casualties among both rescuers and crash victims. Sarah's team acknowledged their tasking and immediately began moving toward the crash site. Their reconnaissance training made them ideally suited for assessing the situation and determining rescue requirements. Rodriguez's unit received orders to establish a security perimeter and prepare for casualty evacuation. Their role was crucial because the terrain made helicopter evacuation impossible, requiring ground transportation of any injured survivors. Maria Santos found herself in an unprecedented situation. Her observer status had been designed for training exercise evaluation, not participation in actual emergency operations. However, her medical training and tactical experience could prove valuable during rescue operations. "Command, this is Observer 1, Maria transmitted. Request permission to participate in rescue operations. I have combat medical training and tactical experience that might be useful." Mitchell considered her request quickly. Emergency operations required maximum use of available expertise, and Maria's medical knowledge could be life-saving if the aircraft occupants were injured. "Observer 1, permission granted for medical support role. Coordinate with Marine unit for transportation to crash site." Rodriguez overheard this transmission with mixed emotions. He had spent days criticizing Maria's capabilities, but Now her expertise was being requested for an operation where lives hung in the balance. The movement toward the crash site revealed terrain challenges that made the rescue operation extremely complex. The aircraft had come down in a steep ravine surrounded by dense vegetation and loose rock that made access treacherous even for healthy personnel. Sarah's team reached the ravine edge first and began assessing approach routes. What they saw below was both encouraging and terrifying. The aircraft appeared to be a small private plane that had made a controlled emergency landing, avoiding the complete destruction that would have resulted from an uncontrolled crash. However, the plane was positioned precariously on a narrow ledge with a 30-meter drop below. Any rescue attempt would need to account for the possibility that movement could destabilize the aircraft and send it cascading into the ravine. "Command, this is Alpha Team Leader," Sarah reported. "Aircraft is a small civilian plane, appears intact but unstable position. I can see movement inside the cockpit, indicating at least one survivor. Recommend immediate deployment of technical rescue equipment." Rodriguez's unit arrived at the ravine shortly after Sarah's initial assessment. Looking down at the crash site, even Rodriguez had to admit that approaching the aircraft would require exactly the kind of specialized skills that SEAL training provided. The terrain was steep, unstable, and covered with obstacles that would challenge even experienced climbers. Standard marine equipment included basic rope and rappelling gear, but this situation required more sophisticated rescue techniques. "Alpha Team, this is Command," Mitchell transmitted. "What are your technical capabilities for aircraft access?" Sarah quickly inventoried her team's equipment and expertise. "Sir, we have advanced rappelling gear, emergency medical supplies, and personnel qualified for technical rescue operations. We can establish rope access to the aircraft within 30 minutes. The assessment was optimistic but realistic. SEAL training included mountain and maritime rescue procedures that were directly applicable to the current situation. "Marine units, establish security perimeter and casualty collection point," Mitchell ordered. "Prepare for multiple casualties requiring immediate medical attention and ground evacuation." Rodriguez began deploying his Marines in support roles while watching Sarah's team prepare for what he now recognized as an extremely dangerous rescue attempt. The female SEALs would be risking their own lives to save civilians they had never met, demonstrating exactly the kind of courage and selflessness that defined military service at its highest level. Maria Santos positioned herself at the casualty collection point where her medical training could be most effective. Her rehabilitation had focused on rebuilding physical capabilities, but her medical knowledge remained completely intact. Sarah's preparation for the rescue descent was methodical and professional. She personally checked every piece of equipment while briefing her team on procedures and contingency plans. The operation would require precise coordination between multiple personnel working in extremely hazardous conditions. "Torres, your primary rappel leader," Sarah instructed. "Kim handles communication relay between aircraft and command. Park prepares stabilization equipment for aircraft security." Each assignment reflected individual expertise while ensuring comprehensive coverage of rescue requirements. The team's preparation demonstrated the kind of systematic approach that made complex operations successful. As Torres began her descent toward the aircraft, everyone watching held their breath. The rope system was secure, but loose rock and unstable terrain created multiple hazards that could injure or kill rescuers, as well as crash victims. Rodriguez found himself genuinely concerned for Torres' safety, a reaction that surprised him given his previous attitudes toward the female SEALs. Watching someone risk their life for others had a way of clarifying what really mattered. Torres reached the aircraft safely and immediately began assessing the occupants. "Command, this is Alpha 2, she reported. "I have 2 civilians in the cockpit, both conscious, but one appears to have serious leg injury. Aircraft is stable for now, but any significant movement could shift position." The situation was more complex than initially apparent. 2 casualties meant multiple trips or simultaneous evacuation procedures. The injured passenger would require careful handling to prevent additional injury during extraction. "Alpha 2, can you assess aircraft stability for occupant extraction?" Sarah asked. Torres examined the plane's position carefully before responding. "Aircraft weight distribution is precarious. Removing occupants might actually improve stability by reducing load on the leading edge." This was crucial information because it meant that rescue operations might reduce rather than increase the danger of aircraft displacement. However, the assessment required trust in Torres' technical judgment under pressure. "Command, Request permission to begin occupant extraction, Sarah transmitted. Mitchell faced a command decision that involved significant risk. Authorizing the rescue attempt could save lives, but might also endanger rescue personnel. However, leaving the occupants in their current position was equally dangerous. Alpha Team, permission granted for extraction operations. Execute rescue plan. What followed was a demonstration of technical skill, courage, and teamwork that impressed everyone watching. Torres secured the first occupant, an elderly man who appeared to have only minor injuries, and guided him through a careful extraction that required precise coordination with the surface team. Sarah descended to assist with the more complex extraction of the injured passenger, a woman in her 50s who had suffered what appeared to be a broken leg and possible internal injuries. Her extraction required improvised medical stabilization combined with technical rope procedures. Rodriguez watched these operations with growing admiration for skills that he was finally beginning to understand. The female SEALs weren't just meeting military standards. They were exceeding them while operating in conditions that would challenge any military personnel. The injured passenger's extraction proved particularly difficult because her condition required gentle handling that conflicted with the urgency of removing her from the unstable aircraft. Sarah and Torres worked together with precision that reflected extensive training and mutual trust. Coming up with Casualty 2, Sarah reported as they began the careful ascent with their injured passenger. Suspect compound fracture of left leg and possible internal injuries. Priority medical attention required. Maria Santos prepared to receive the injured woman, drawing on medical training that had been dormant since her own injury, but remained fully applicable to emergency situations. Her hands were steady and her assessment skills sharp as she prepared for immediate casualty evaluation. The successful extraction of both aircraft occupants represented a triumph of skill, courage, and teamwork that transcended any of the petty conflicts that had preceded it. Rodriguez and his Marines had provided essential support, while Sarah's team had executed a technically demanding rescue under genuinely dangerous conditions. As the injured passengers received medical attention and prepared for evacuation to base medical facilities, the various participants in the morning's exercise began processing what they had experienced. Rodriguez approached Sarah as her team secured their equipment after the successful rescue operation. For the first time since the Plaza incident, he seemed uncertain about what to say. "Ma'am," Rodriguez began hesitantly, "that was outstanding work by your team. I've never seen anything like that kind of technical rescue capability." Sarah accepted the acknowledgement without triumphalism. "Thank you, Sergeant. Your unit's support was essential for mission success. We couldn't have done it alone." The exchange was brief, but significant because it represented Rodriguez's first explicit acknowledgement of SEAL capabilities and his own previous errors in judgment. Maria Santos had played a crucial role in stabilizing the injured passenger, applying medical skills that proved her continued value despite physical limitations. Her performance during the emergency had demonstrated that wounded warriors retained capabilities that remained essential for military operations. Colonel Mitchell observed these interactions with satisfaction. The emergency had revealed important truths about unit capabilities, individual character, and the value of cooperation that no training exercise could have demonstrated as effectively. As the evacuation helicopters departed with the rescued civilians, all participants understood that they had experienced something more significant than a routine training exercise or emergency response. They had witnessed and participated in a demonstration of military values at their highest expression. The real evaluation would come in the days ahead, as they processed what they had learned about themselves, their colleagues, and the meaning of military service. The wounded Marine had walked past mockery and harassment to observe an exercise that became something much more profound, a lesson about courage that none of them would ever forget. The crisis had ended, but its impact on everyone involved was just beginning. The weeks following the rescue operation brought profound changes to the atmosphere on the military base. News of the successful civilian rescue had spread through official channels and informal networks, creating a narrative that transcended the original exercise objectives. What had begun as a demonstration of inter-service cooperation had evolved into something approaching legend. Rodriguez found himself in an uncomfortable position as various accounts of the rescue circulated throughout the base. In some versions, he was portrayed as having supported the operation effectively. In others, his previous antagonism toward the female SEALs was contrasted sharply with his behavior during the actual emergency. The internal conflict this created was profound. Rodriguez had built much of his military identity around assumptions about capability, standards, and the proper role of women in combat. The rescue operation had systematically demolished those assumptions, leaving him to reconstruct his understanding of what made effective military personnel. 3 weeks after the rescue, Rodriguez made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He requested a meeting with Colonel Mitchell to discuss his observations about the joint exercise and rescue operation. "Sir, I need to report some things about the exercise that I think are important," Rodriguez announced when he entered Mitchell's office. Mitchell gestured toward a chair, curious about what the sergeant wanted to discuss. Rodriguez had been unusually subdued since the rescue operation, avoiding the kind of vocal criticism that had characterized his previous behavior. "What's on your mind, Sergeant?" Mitchell inquired. Rodriguez took a deep breath before beginning. "Sir, I think I made some serious errors in judgment about our Navy colleagues and about wounded personnel capabilities. The rescue operation showed me that my assumptions were wrong. The admission was painful, but necessary." Rodriguez had spent weeks reviewing the events of the exercise and rescue, trying to reconcile what he had witnessed with his previous beliefs about military effectiveness. "Can you be more specific?" Mitchell requested. "Yes, sir. I believe that physical standards were being compromised to accommodate women in combat roles. The rescue operation proved that the female SEALs not only meet those standards but exceed them in areas that I hadn't considered." Rodriguez paused, gathering courage for the more difficult part of his confession. "I also believe that wounded personnel like Staff Sergeant Santos were liabilities rather than assets. Her performance during the rescue proved that experience and medical knowledge remain valuable even when physical capability is limited." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. These admissions represented significant personal growth for a man who had previously shown little capacity for self-reflection or admission of error. "What do you think changed your perspective?" Mitchell asked. Rodriguez considered the question carefully. "Watching people risk their lives for strangers, sir. When someone is rappelling down a cliff to save civilians, questions about gender or physical limitations become irrelevant. What matters is whether they can do the job." The observation was simple but profound. Rodriguez had discovered that actual performance under pressure revealed capabilities that were invisible during peacetime evaluation or theoretical discussion. "Do you have any recommendations based on these observations?" Mitchell inquired. "Yes, sir. I think we need better integration between units and better understanding of what different specialties bring to operations. I also think we're wasting valuable experience when we underestimate wounded personnel." These recommendations represented a complete reversal of Rodriguez's previous positions. Where he had once advocated for separation and exclusion, he now saw value in integration and inclusion. Mitchell was pleased with Rodriguez's transformation, but also recognized that changing established attitudes throughout the military would require more than individual conversions. Institutional change needed systematic effort and visible leadership commitment. "Sergeant, I'm going to give you an opportunity to demonstrate these new perspectives," Mitchell announced. "I'm recommending you for assignment to an inter-service training development program. Your job will be helping design exercises that promote better cooperation between different units and specialties." The assignment was both reward and challenge. Rodriguez would have opportunities to influence military training development, but he would also be required to work closely with exactly the kind of personnel he had previously criticized. Meanwhile, Sarah Chun was dealing with her own aftermath from the rescue operation. Her team's performance had generated positive attention from senior Navy leadership, creating opportunities for advancement and additional responsibilities. Admiral Catherine Walsh, commander of Special Operations Forces for the region, had requested a detailed briefing about the rescue operation and its implications for future training development. "Commander Chun, your team's performance during the rescue operation has been noted at the highest levels," Admiral Walsh announced during their meeting. "We're considering several initiatives that would build on the lessons learned from that experience." Sarah listened carefully as Walsh outlined plans for expanded joint training programs, improved integration protocols, and enhanced emergency response capabilities that would incorporate lessons from the rescue operation. "One proposal involves establishing you as lead instructor for a new inter-service special operations course," Walsh continued. "The position would involve developing curriculum that prepares personnel from all services for joint operations." The opportunity was significant, but also daunting. Sarah would be responsible for training military personnel from different services, many of whom might share Rodriguez's initial skepticism about female capabilities. "Ma'am, what would be the scope of such a program?" Sarah inquired. Comprehensive preparation for joint special operations, including technical rescue, combat operations, and inter-service coordination, Walsh explained. The goal would be producing personnel who can work effectively with any unit regardless of service affiliation or specialized training. Sarah recognized the ambitious nature of this proposal. Creating effective joint training required understanding the strengths and limitations of different military cultures while developing procedures that maximize combined capabilities. I would need exceptional instructor personnel to make such a program effective, Sarah noted. You would have access to the best instructors from all services, Walsh assured her, including some personnel who might surprise you with their qualifications and perspectives. The reference was subtle but clear. Walsh was suggesting that Rodriguez and others who had demonstrated growth during the rescue operation might become valuable contributors to joint training development. Maria Santos was experiencing her own form of recognition and opportunity. Dr. Hayes had recommended her for assignment to a military medical research program that studied rehabilitation and return-to-duty protocols for wounded personnel. Staff Sergeant Santos, your performance during the rescue operation demonstrated capabilities that we believe represent broader patterns among wounded personnel, Dr. Hayes explained during their meeting. We want you to help develop better procedures for evaluating and utilizing those capabilities. The research assignment would involve working with wounded personnel from all services to identify skills and knowledge that remained valuable despite physical limitations. Maria's own experience would provide crucial insights into the rehabilitation process and its impact on military effectiveness. Doctor, what would this research involve? Maria asked. Systematic evaluation of wounded personnel capabilities, development of assessment protocols, and creation of assignment procedures that match personnel strengths with mission requirements, Dr. Hayes replied. The scope was broad enough to potentially influence military policy regarding wounded warriors throughout all services. Maria would have opportunities to ensure that future wounded personnel received better evaluation and utilization than she had initially experienced. I'm particularly interested in your observations about the value of experience versus physical capability, Dr. Hayes continued. Your medical knowledge was crucial during the rescue operation despite your mobility limitations. Maria nodded, understanding that her example could help change how the military approached wounded personnel evaluation. Rather than focusing primarily on physical limitations, assessment protocols could emphasize retained capabilities and transferable skills. 6 months after the rescue operation, the three principal figures found themselves working together again, though in very different circumstances. The inter-service training program had been approved and was conducting its first pilot course with Rodriguez serving as a senior instructor alongside Sarah Chun. The transformation was remarkable. Rodriguez had become one of the program's most effective instructors, bringing credibility with traditional military personnel who might otherwise resist integration initiatives. His conversion experience made him particularly effective at addressing skepticism and resistance from participants. The key insight, Rodriguez explained to a new class of joint operations students, is that different doesn't mean deficient. Each service and specialty brings unique capabilities that become force multipliers when properly integrated. The statement would have been unthinkable from Rodriguez 8 months earlier, but his experience during the rescue operation had fundamentally altered his understanding of military effectiveness. Sarah Chun observed Rodriguez's instruction with satisfaction, but no triumphalism. She had never sought to humiliate him or other skeptics. Her goal had always been proving that integration enhanced rather than compromised military capability. Sergeant Rodriguez makes an important point, Sarah added to the class discussion. Successful joint operations require understanding what each participant brings to the mission and how those capabilities can be optimized through coordination. The collaboration between Sarah and Rodriguez was genuine rather than forced. Both had learned to value what the other brought to training development, creating synergy that enhanced the program's effectiveness. Maria Santos contributed to the program as a guest instructor, sharing her research findings about wounded personnel capabilities and rehabilitation outcomes. Her presentations consistently challenged assumptions about the relationship between physical limitation and military value. Experience doesn't disappear when someone is wounded, Maria explained to a recent class. Medical knowledge, tactical understanding, leadership skills, and situational awareness remain intact. The challenge is creating assignment procedures that utilize those capabilities effectively. Her research had documented numerous cases of wounded personnel who continued contributing significantly to military operations despite physical limitations. The findings were reshaping policies throughout the military services. The program's success exceeded all expectations. Graduates consistently demonstrated superior performance during joint operations, and requests for program expansion came from commands throughout the military. What had begun as an experimental initiative was becoming standard preparation for advanced military personnel. Colonel Mitchell observed these developments with deep satisfaction. The rescue operation had catalyzed changes that were improving military effectiveness across multiple dimensions. Individual transformation had led to institutional improvement that would benefit the military for years to come. It's remarkable how crisis can reveal capabilities that remain hidden during normal operations, Mitchell reflected during a program review meeting. The rescue operation showed us that our assumptions about effectiveness were limiting our potential. Admiral Walsh nodded agreement. The program demonstrates that diversity of capability enhances rather than compromises unit effectiveness. We're producing personnel who can adapt to any operational environment. The success stories continued accumulating. Program graduates led successful operations in various theaters, consistently demonstrating superior performance when working with unfamiliar units or under unusual circumstances. Rodriguez had been promoted to staff sergeant and was being considered for additional advancement based on his training development contributions. His transformation from skeptic to advocate had made him particularly valuable for reaching personnel who might otherwise resist integration initiatives. Sarah Chun had been promoted to lieutenant commander and was developing advanced joint operations curriculum for senior military personnel. Her technical expertise combined with demonstrated leadership capabilities made her ideal for preparing military leaders who would manage increasingly complex joint operations. Maria Santos had completed her research assignment and was being considered for promotion to gunnery sergeant based on her contributions to wounded warrior policy development. Her work was influencing rehabilitation and assignment procedures throughout the military. The changes extended far beyond the three individuals who had been central to the original confrontation. The base where the events occurred had become a model for inter-service cooperation and integration. Personnel throughout the command demonstrated improved collaboration and mutual respect across service and specialty boundaries. The rescue operation itself had become a case study used in military schools throughout the country. Students analyzed the technical procedures, leadership decisions, and inter-service coordination that made the rescue successful. The case study emphasized that effective military operations required diverse capabilities working in harmony. A year after the rescue operation, the three principals found themselves together again during a ceremony recognizing their contributions to military training development. Colonel Mitchell was presenting awards that acknowledged their individual achievements and collective impact on military effectiveness. The events of the past year demonstrate something fundamental about military service, Mitchell announced to the assembled personnel. Courage takes many forms, competence appears in unexpected places, and cooperation multiplies the strength of individual capabilities. Rodriguez accepted his award with humility that would have surprised anyone who had known him a year earlier. His transformation from antagonist to advocate represented the kind of personal growth that military service could inspire under the right circumstances. Sarah Chun received recognition for technical excellence and leadership that had advanced inter-service cooperation throughout the military. Her willingness to defend principles despite personal risk had catalyzed changes that benefited military effectiveness broadly. Maria Santos was honored for demonstrating that wounded warriors retained valuable capabilities that the military needed to preserve and utilize. Her courage in continuing to serve despite physical challenges had changed how the military approached wounded personnel evaluation. As the ceremony concluded, the three found themselves walking together across the same plaza where their initial confrontation had occurred. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The location that had witnessed prejudice and misunderstanding had become the starting point for transformation and growth. It's hard to believe how much has changed, Rodriguez reflected as they paused near the flagpole where he had once mocked Maria's struggles. People change when they're willing to learn from experience, Sarah replied. The rescue operation showed all of us that our assumptions needed adjustment. Maria looked around the plaza, remembering her painful daily walks and the harassment she had endured. I think we learned that courage isn't about being the strongest or fastest. It's about continuing to serve even when circumstances make that difficult. The observation was profound because it captured something essential about military service that transcended physical capability or gender roles. Courage was fundamentally about commitment to something larger than personal comfort or convenience. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a young Marine who clearly wanted to speak with them. Private First Class Jennifer Taylor was new to the base and had heard stories about the rescue operation and training program development. "Excuse me, ma'am, sergeants," Taylor began hesitantly. "I wanted to thank you for the changes you've made here. This base feels different from others I've been stationed at. More cooperative, more focused on what people can do rather than what they can't." The comment captured something important about the broader impact of their efforts. Individual transformation had created cultural change that affected everyone in the command, making the military more effective and more inclusive simultaneously. Rodriguez responded first, his voice reflecting genuine conviction. "Private Taylor, the changes came from learning to value what each person brings to the mission. That's something we should have understood from the beginning." Sarah nodded agreement. Military effectiveness depends on utilizing every available capability. When we limit ourselves through prejudice or assumption, we compromise our own success. Maria added her own perspective. Everyone faces challenges at some point in their career. The question is whether we support each other through those challenges or use them as excuses for division. As the young Marine departed, the three veterans understood that their legacy would be measured not by individual achievement, but by the institutional changes they had helped create. The rescue operation had been a catalyst, but the real accomplishment was building a military culture that valued capability over stereotypes. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Each day brought new opportunities to demonstrate that diversity of capability enhanced military effectiveness. The wounded Marine who had once walked alone through mockery now walked alongside colleagues who valued her contributions. The female SEALs who had proven their technical excellence continued advancing inter-service cooperation through innovative training programs. The skeptical Marine who had questioned their competence had become their most effective advocate for institutional change. Together, they had learned that real strength came from recognizing and utilizing the capabilities that each person brought to military service, regardless of gender, specialty, or physical limitation. Their story had become proof that courage, properly understood, could transform not just individuals, but entire institutions. The base that had once been divided by prejudice and misunderstanding had become a model of cooperation and mutual respect. The transformation would influence military culture for generations, proving that positive change was possible when people were willing to learn from experience and grow beyond their original assumptions. Minutes after a wounded Marine had walked past mockery, the female SEALs had indeed shocked everyone who doubted them. But the greatest shock was how their courage had inspired transformation that benefited everyone involved. The real victory was not individual recognition, but collective growth that made the military stronger and more effective than anyone had imagined possible.